Bit of housekeeping before we get to the interview. You may have noticed that the output of episodes of the Bible Lore podcast has slowed down. Sorry about that. I probably should have addressed this sooner, but everything has happened so fast. Indulge me a little personal history here. During the fall of last year, Amanda and I moved back from Austria to the United States, and after a fruitless job hunt, I started studying to be an electrician. Things sped up and slowed down off and on here and there. It was mostly fine. I figured I had a few interviews and Bible at the Movies episodes scheduled, and everything would be pretty normal. Then, out of nowhere, a couple weeks ago, I got a decent enough paying job at a steel foundry, which will help with my quest to become an electrician. Anyway, I was unexpectedly moved to night shift and put to work emptying about 5 feet of sand from the top floor of a sand silo after a pipe burst. It was a whole thing. That all happened in like 4 days. So all that to say, I've been incredibly tired and sore from doing physical labor that I am admittedly and embarrassingly unaccustomed to. All of this means that the pace of the Bible Lore podcast has slowed to a near halt almost overnight. This show takes a lot of reading and research. I always read at least one of a scholar's books, usually two, and a few papers and articles before doing any interview. I have around 3, usually 4 starting sources for any given scripted episode, a couple generic reference guides, and a handful of articles and other books, which you'll always find in the bibliography portion of the episode description, of course. All that's to say, this show is a fair bit of work. I've had a lot less time to devote to it, and that is obviously a bummer for both me and you. Getting on to what this means for you, I'm going to keep a pace of about an episode per month to start with going forward, because I'm not giving up on this little show that could. I love doing it, and I hope you all have enjoyed the journey so far and are looking forward to the 1,000 years of history ahead of us based on the giant rough sketch I drew up when I started this a year and a half ago. This isn't goodbye. You're not getting rid of me that easy. This is just, oh shit, I gotta figure out how to rebalance work, life, and podcast, and hopefully I'll find a good groove again soon. If that's not enough for my wonderful Patreon subscribers, I completely understand. I'm now once again earning a regular wage, and so that's a nice thing. Things are taken care of. This episode releases at the same time for everyone so that you all get the news simultaneously, but for those Patreon subscribers who stick around, you'll be getting fortnight early access to all future episodes of the Bible Lore podcast. That's 2 whole weeks. So here's to many more episodes and years of the Bible Lore podcast. Thanks to everyone who's made it this far in the ride. On to my interview with Andrew Tobolowsky. Welcome back to the Bible Lore podcast. Today I am absolutely thrilled to be bringing along scholar Andrew Tobolowsky. Andrew is Associate Professor of Religious Studies at the College of William and Mary and the author of several books, including The Sons of Jacob and the Sons of Heracles, as well as The Myth of the 12 Tribes of Israel, New Identities Across Space and Time. With his work, Andrew has done something truly phenomenal. A few times on this show, we've discussed some of the tedium found in the Hebrew Bible, the especially notorious sections of genealogies and lists that feature great repetition, which will challenge all but the most dedicated readers to not skim. Because we're just now in the exile, the 4th or 3rd century book of Chronicles has not really come up in detail, but the book begins perhaps with the most infamous case of torturous lists of names, 9 chapters of genealogies that Andrew has irrefutably demonstrated can be interesting if understood in the right context. A Herculean feat if there ever was one. So with that, Andrew, enjoy a hero's welcome here at the Ale House at the end of the world.
Well, thanks so much for having me. I'm looking forward to talking about the tribes today.
Yeah, absolutely. So speaking of the tribes, what do we actually know about the existence of these tribes in Israel? I mean, obviously, tribes are a real thing, right? Like that's a tribal identity. I'm sure everyone has a different term for what that means, and the boundaries around that are probably fuzzy. But what do we actually know about the tribal structure of Israel and Judah before the destructions of Samaria and then Jerusalem? Do we know which ones were real and which ones weren't, or do we have suspicions on that?
That's a great question. So We know surprisingly little on one level. Outside of the Bible, there is a almost complete absence of any references to the tribes. The Mesha Stela from the mid 9th century BCE seems to mention the tribe of Gad. It says the men of Gad lived in the land of Ataroth from early periods. But other than that, and we have, tons and tons of names now from different places. People write their name, so and so, son of so and so, and so on. Not one of them ever mentions that they're a member of a tribe. So a lot of it depends on what you think about different biblical traditions. It seems perfectly clear that the tribes of Judah, Benjamin, and Levi were eventually a real thing, whether all of them were early tribes. We get even in the New Testament, you get Paul talking about being a Benjaminite. And I suspect that the tribes in Judges 5, which is probably the oldest biblical text, I don't know if we can call them Israelite yet. I don't know if we can call them judges yet. I mean, I don't
Sure.
know if we can call them tribes yet. It's a complicated term, but they don't include Judah, Levi, Benjamin, and Gad. They probably are real groups from a very early period in Israel's history. So I think that the tribes have the role they have in biblical traditions for reasons that don't have much to do with history, but that they are based on a historical reality from very early periods.
Right. And the Levites are weirder still because like it seems like a priestly class,
Yeah.
and then people, like the way that it's described, you could have people from other tribes that seem to be Levites. It's kind of there's a lot of, again, the entire concept is very fuzzy within the Bible itself, and then obviously in the absence of any real attestation of this in the archaeological record. So that already puts us kind of on sort of an interesting foot going forward here. Um, we have these tribes. Many of them probably existed in some way. Do we know, like, so with that lack of being able to like confirm it, we don't know whether like the descriptions of where they're located, it does that have any reality at all? I assume the ones that are north are probably north to some extent. The ones that are south are probably south. Can we say anything beyond that, really?
That's a great question. So this Joshua 13 through 22 tribal apportionment narratives is really hard to figure out. Like you say, the Levites are an important problem here, where there isn't any evidence that they were a tribe in early periods. They probably start out as a priesthood, and then biblical authors, when they sort of evolve a system of trying to organize Israelite identities according to a tribal framework, transformed this priesthood into the idea of a tribe to place them within this context. And I say that because, like, most likely Joshua 13 through 22 is organized by the same authors, the priestly authors who are involved in kind of inventing the concept of Levi. And one of the ways that we can tell that, there are a lot of priestly figures who show up at various points in these passages. Phinehas, for example, Eliezer, But overall, it's a 12 tribe scheme of apportioning these territories, which you don't see in Judges 5. You don't see it in Deuteronomy 33. You don't see it in some other places. So the framework is late.
Yeah.
Levi is probably late. I'm not convinced there was a tribe of Judah in early periods, but that doesn't mean that all of the tribal apportionments are based on nothing. And I think,
Sure.
like I lived in Ireland for a year. I got a master's in literature over there, and that's the
Cool.
kind of place too where you see a last name, you can often guess where somebody is from. These
Right.
people were on this region, whatever. So I suspect something like that is going on. I don't. There wasn't a conquest. I don't think these are like early lists, but I think that they often convey a general sense of where people who identified according to this tribe or another lived.
Yeah. Right. And so for, I guess, context for everyone at home, Joshua 13 is set kind of, it's after, obviously it's after Moses dies. It's in the book of Joshua, or is taken into the heavens to live with the gods, depending on the tradition you ascribe to about Moses' fate. But it takes place after the conquest, and it's this, again, it's this list. It starts out, it's like, uh, the other half of the tribe of Manasseh, half tribe of Manasseh, the Reubenites and Gadites receive their inheritance. It goes on and on about all the details. It goes into great detail. This is one of those passages where there's all of these lists of names and details, and it's in so much descriptive detail that you're like, it can be kind of overwhelming to read about it, and you're like, where do we have any like any details about like the geography? I assume makes sense and is from someone that's familiar with the territory and all of that, but do we have anything beyond that at all?
Do we have anything beyond? That's a good question. So, you know, in this 12 tribe scheme, so Joshua 13, and one of the things to notice about Joshua 13 through 22 is that, like in Joshua 12, there's no reason to think that anything is remaining to be conquered or divided.
Right.
1 through 12 kind of covered it already. So that's part of the reason that people often think 13 through 22 is it's related to this priestly author. It's kind of separated from 1 through 12. Um, Probably the Transjordanian tribes had not existed for a long time. I'm not convinced that there was ever a tribe of Manasseh out there, which we can talk about. But, this is a region where Moab and Ammon and Aram are often more dominant than Israel. Falls to Tiglath-Pileser III before the Assyrian conquest in 722. What do they know about these tribes? I think not much. So if you look at the apportionment of Manasseh, for example, it like basically says the same thing in 4 or 5 different ways. It says like they got the kingdom of Bashan, they got Og's place Bashan, they got the cities of Bashan, and like that just tells me they don't really know what they're doing.
Yeah, yeah,
But
you've got an author there who seems to be like, well, I got to fill out all these details. I got to make sure all the boxes are ticked here.
right. But in terms of like Issachar, Asher, Naphtali, really a lot of the ones that show up in Judges 5, they're fairly consistently portrayed, at least in general regions. Like they're in the vicinity of the Jezreel. The hill country of Ephraim is the hill country of Ephraim,
Right.
even in texts that don't say anything about the tribes. Benjamin, whatever its historical affiliations, is consistently depicted as between Ephraim and Judah. So I think there's a fair amount of roughly accurate reminiscences there.
Right. Okay, that makes sense. Where do you see the beginning of this conception of specifically 12 tribes
Yeah.
becoming important? Like before, during, after the exile? This is kind of, what's the Zitzim Leben here, as they would say?
Great question. I think the big question that I've been thinking about a lot lately. So I'm currently working on a new book on the tribes. I'm trying to put it all together. I've written a lot of
Nice.
articles and I've written a lot of little things and big things with different topics for Eyes and Browns for Penn State University Press. So I've been thinking about this again. I proposed in The Sons of Jacob and the Sons of Heracles that the 12 tribes tradition was invented by the priestly authors who are, I think, exilic and post-exilic, especially post-exilic, and mostly visible. It's mostly visible in the books of Numbers. I think it's possible that there are some Deuteronomistic ideas of the 12 tribes. But the Deuteronomy very rarely says how many tribes there are. After
Mm.
Numbers, very few references to the 12. And they almost always happen in the context of descriptions of items that symbolize 12 tribes in some way. So, like in Kings, Elijah builds an altar of 12 stones. That's
Mm-hmm.
like the only reference to 12 there is. And it really reminds you of a lot of the other places outside of Numbers where you see 12, which is really only like the tabernacle narrative. Like Moses builds an altar of 12 stones. There are 12 stones in the priestly breastplate. Joshua 3 through 4. Joshua builds an altar of 12 stones. Those are really the places where you see 12. And even this Chronicles genealogy, even if it starts with 1 Chron 2, 1 through 2, it's got, the 12 sons of Jacob. It actually doesn't ever describe a genealogy of the tribe of Dan. So even that's not a 12 tribe genealogy.
Ah, that's an interesting point.
Yeah, so one thing that's certainly true is that the 12 tribes are most important to the authors of Numbers.
Yeah.
And Numbers represents Israel in the wilderness as a 12 tribe community organized around, a mobile sanctuary, the tabernacle. It's really invested in it. The early tribal lists, Judges 5 is not a 12 tribe list. Genesis 49 is probably constructed from parts. I don't think you see it in early periods. But even if you do see it in early periods, even if someone thinks you do, that's not why it has the role that it has in the Bible. Instead, it's in this exilic, conjured vision of the Israelite past, probably post-exilic, that we see especially in Numbers.
With that, do we know anything about, or do you have any ideas of the kind of purpose of this? Like, what is the overall vision that the 12 tribes schema really affords the author?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think that from early periods already, I've been thinking a lot about this. I think naming something as a tribe is often a literary strategy to laying claim to it. So if you talk about Gad in particular, it's the only tribe that appears outside of the Bible. As I've said, it appears in the Mesha Stela in the middle of the 800s BCE, probably. That region, so Mesha says, like, Omri conquered this region, then I conquered it from him. There's not really a lot of evidence that the region of Gad ever went back in Israelite hands. So Gad is not in Judges 5. It is in most tribal lists after that. You get the sense that, like, they've decided we're going to lay claim to this region by transforming this people group into a tribe of Israel. We're going to keep calling it a tribe of Israel forever. That's our way of saying we should have that territory. And as time goes on, I think that happens more often. It's something that happens with the Levites as well, where an emerging vision of a pan-Israelite Israel that includes both Israel and Judah, that is unified around Jerusalem, that is unified around a sacred center, develops, and the convenient way of organizing all the different groups around the center is to identify them as all the same thing, to say these are the tribes of Israel. And Numbers does that in the tabernacle narratives and the vision of Israel in the wilderness, throughout Numbers. And it's saying, like, this is the ideal form of Israel. It's also coupled with this discourse where the appropriate leaders of Israel are actually appointed tribal leaders. So repeatedly throughout Numbers, Deuteronomy, you see, like, tribal leaders coming to Moses. So it's probably a post-monarchic, who should be in charge of us kind of
Sure,
thing.
sure.
It's a cult centralization thing because it's always in the context of us being around the sacred center. So yeah, I mean, they take this vestigial tribal system, which still exists in some ways. They take identities that some of them still existed, and they create a paradigm that is a idealized vision of pan-Israelite Israel that makes sense to mostly post-exilic priestly and post-Deuteronomistic authors.
Right. I mean that absolutely makes sense. That and yeah, I mean it's kind of fascinating. Again, like you said, it seems like parts of these tribes, for example, Gad is located in it's Transjordanian, so it's on the other side of the river. It's in what is modern day Jordan. And as you mentioned, it seems like since before the time of Tiglath-Pileser's reforms and all of that, there doesn't seem to have been a lot of presence there, and that kind of makes it again very interesting how there are these traditions that go back quite a ways, and it is a little bit of a bummer because one of my favorite noteworthy things is that it's possible that the kingdom of Hamat, north in I think it's in somewhere in central Lebanon or something like that, up the valley a ways, did have Yahwistic kings. They don't get a tribe. A bit of a bummer. That could have been
Yep.
sort of a fun. I don't think we have any references to that. That only was discovered through archaeology. That's truly, I think, our first actually lost tribe of Israel in some way, or of Yahweh, if you
Yeah.
want to call it that. So this vision of Joshua in Joshua 13 to 22 that you talk about, it kind of seems to gain, wherever it landed, it does gain purchase in the post-exilic period. Exilic and post-exilic period is when, like you said, a lot of the 12 tribe stuff really seems to come together. it- why does it gain that sort of importance? You mentioned stuff about living in a post-monarchic society. What is the kind of political potential ideology behind that we're looking at?
Yeah. So I think one of the most important things to notice about the overall vision of history in Genesis through Kings is this discourse of the lost tribes of Israel. In 2 Kings 17, as you know, the authors sort of falsely claim that lots and lots of Israelites were taken away to Assyria, never to come back. Some were, the Assyrian records say like 27,000 or something, but not nearly enough to make a big difference. So we already know that these are authors who are in part using the tribal concept to identify themselves as the only remaining legitimate heirs of ancient Israel. They're saying, like, we're all with the 12 tribes of Israel, but only the Judite tribes are still here. Everybody else is somewhere else, even though there's still tribes in Israel. And then in 2 Kings 25, when you're talking about the Babylonian conquest, it's the same thing, where it, acts like everybody went into exile, but actually lots of people probably remained behind. So I would see the people responsible for these layers of the Pentateuch as people who are first living in exile, who are trying to position themselves as the legitimate heirs of Israel against Israelites still living in Israel, Judahites still living in Israel and in Judah. And then as they start to come back, even Israelites and Judahites who are still living in diaspora, who are places like Elephantini, who are the Marashu archives and things like that. So they're doing two things. They are defining Israel as the 12 tribes of Israel, and they're making sure that you know that now there's only Judah, Levi, and Benjamin. And they're the ones rebuilding the temple, and they're trying to give legitimacy to themselves, and they're the ones who are occupying this land, and they're trying to give legitimacy to themselves as in terms of territory, in terms of religion, and they're doing it by this double move of we're connected to all Israel through this vision, and also most of it's gone except for us.
Right. And I think something else that's there is because it's in this priestly vision. And again, like you said, the tribal leaders are given this elevated space within these texts. There does seem to be something of like a political organization, perhaps a suggestion about how things should be run in an idealized society. And that part of it's always very fascinating to me because it's a little bit different, obviously, than what you see in other places that argue for like the political expediency of having a king, even if you have reservations about him.
Right.
And that part of it is very interesting to me. Again, because it's kind of centering on this idea of a greater Israelite identity. And I guess a question that I have for you that may not be answerable. Do you see any kind of we would call it Israelite Samaritan, or sorry, not Israelite, like Judean Samaritan ecumenicism, sort of like is there, because we know a lot of these texts did come from the north probably originally. As you mentioned,
Yeah.
the tribal structure itself seems to initially not even include the south. Um, but this becomes kind of a key moment in establishing this larger. Is there any input, do you think, from people from the north in this?
Yeah, so a lot of people have been thinking about this and talking about this lately. Um, I struggle with the paradigm. I struggle with the idea that like somehow they literally got in the room together and like wrote something.
Right.
I mean, I can see them responding to each other in a form of a dialogue. So one of the things that I always point out, you talk about the Samaritans. Even today, the Samaritans identify by tribe. They're Manassite, Ephraimite, Levite, tribal members in the Samaritan. Maybe the Manassites died out. I don't quite remember, but
Like there's only like
um,
1,000 Samaritans left or something like
yeah.
that.
But they have identified, unlike the Jews, they continue to identify by tribes. They have for thousands of years. So if my reconstruction of the history of tribal concepts is correct, I don't see any reason that there wasn't sort of uninterrupted tribal identification throughout the history of Israel and its post history, the post monarchical history. As you say, some of the traditions that end up in the Hebrew Bible come from there. Is it the case that they are sort of deciding on their past together, as some recent studies, have argued? I don't see how that's really possible. Is it the case that there's like a dynamic dialogue where like the Judite texts are responding to sometimes positively, sometimes negatively? I think that's reasonable, and I think your listeners probably know that there seems to have been a Samaritan, or really a pre-Samaritan temple on Mount Gerizim, 5th century BCE. Around the same time that the second temple is built, and I often see. I wrote a little book about late antiquity, which was about the competition over Israel identity between Christians, Samaritan Israelites, and Jews in that period. And you do see a very consistent Jewish premise that the Samaritan Israelites are not Israelites because they're not biologically Israelites because of 2 Kings 17. But
Right.
Samaritan Israelites admit that the Jews are the descendants of biblical Israel. And they're like, but you just don't do this right. And then
Yeah.
you have the Christians who are saying, like, actually, biological descent doesn't matter. This, like, true Israel tradition, they're like, we're spiritually Israel, and that's actually better than either of those things. So, I mean, I think some biblical authors knew that it was a tactic to foreignize these people, and
Right.
their own tactics that appear in the Bible. I think those people were pretty anti-Northerners, but that other biblical authors might have been perfectly open to Northern influences.
Yeah, I mean, there's a reason Samaritans don't include everything after the Torah, basically,
Yeah,
because it becomes explicitly anti-northern repeatedly, like throughout it, to the extent where I think Francesca Stavrokopoulou argues that Manasseh was essentially chosen to be kind of the sin bearer for all of this concept of greater Israel,
right.
by having him be the big child sacrifice guy, and his name being Manasseh is no coincidence there, most likely. That part is probably the most interesting to me because it again it cements this mythical quality to the idea of Israel as an identity. How do you think that like this idea of tribes helps to sort of cement that?
A lot of my work, as you know, you may know, has to do with classical comparisons. And you see a really similar phenomenon in the ancient Greek world, where Panhellenism, the idea that all Greeks are Greeks, is not really an early idea. It is something where, you have these groups, they're Dorians, they're Ionians, they're Aetolians, and they think of themselves as Dorians, Ionians, and Aetolians. And then as time goes on, the way that you construct a Panhellenic identity, one of the ways, is you create an overarching genealogical framework from somebody like Helen, which says like, okay, now Doros and Ion and Achaeos, wherever are his descendants. So we're all part of the same genealogical framework. And I think essentially the same thing is going on in the Bible, where the 12 tribes framework is like a net that like expands to catch a diverse array of traditions, some of which were originally Israelite, some of which were Judahite, and to transform them into this pan-Israelite concept. I do think mostly in Genesis through 2 Kings, you see it only in conversation with the discourse that says, but there aren't any other Israelites left, it's just us. But I think it is invented to create a structure for a pan Israelite past. What does Moses have in common with David? Well, David is a descendant of the tribe of Judah, Moses of Levi. They're both in the tribal structure. That's the structure. And then you actually read the books of Samuel. It never actually says that David is a member of the tribe of Judah or anything else.
Yeah, no, that's a great point. That's actually really fascinating. When and like what texts are these Greek concepts coming from? Like when and where does that sort of
Mhm.
start to appear
You
in
really
this idea of Hellenism?
Right. You really see. So there's a debate about what exactly Panhellenism. When you can start talking about it. And so like the Iliad does not use the word Greeks. It does have a sense of the separate identities of these people, but they are doing something together. So some people point to the 8th century BCE, but I think most people would say that the idea of a Pan-Hellenic Greece emerged in the early 5th century BCE in response to the Persian Wars. That you see in Herodotus there's like an assembly in Athens where, and I'm not saying this is a true story. I'm saying Herodotus was writing in
Yeah,
the right
yeah,
time
no, no,
period.
no. Well, we're about to get into Herodotus on the show, so people are about to learn. I mean, I mentioned him
Yeah,
in reference to some of the Babylonian history, and I've got to be like, by the way, just to remind you, this is Herodotus here.
yeah,
So let's
right. Yeah, yeah, but he has this vision of this, like, basically the Persians send the Macedonian king to talk to the Athenians about just giving up and allying with Persia, and the Spartans send an embassy. And the Athenians basically, tell the Spartans, like, of course, we're not going to ally with the Persians. Like, we all have the same temples in common, we have the same language, we have, like, Greekness as a shared touchstone. And I don't think they would have said that a century earlier. I think they would have, talked about Ion because the Athenians are Ionians and the Spartans are Dorians. So, there's some good chronological convergences here where it's all in kind of the context of the Persian Empire that you see this happening.
right, which is again, it's very interesting the parity between the two, because again, if you see those things as maybe having some sort of like inspiration that comes out of the Iliad, this earlier like Iron Age text that been or text and song and epic poem that becomes very important as time goes on. it's kind of similar again, where you see these early forms that are a little bit rougher sketches, but maybe there's something there that gets built on by the Persian period, which again is very kind of almost one to one with the ideas that we see. I mean, there's obviously big differences, but it's fascinating to see these kind of as these political entities expand and we enter this period of like reglobalization
Mhm.
after the Bronze Age downfall. You get these kind of new identities forming in kind of fascinating, new, and complex ways. Um, One of them is these really detailed genealogical lists. Notorious one that I mentioned earlier, First Chronicles 1 through 9, which is I think probably universally agreed on. I mean, I'll just read it. The descendants of Japheth, Gomer, Magog, Medad. It goes on like that. Oh my God, it's 9 chapters.
Yeah.
There are a few little bits in there, but it is almost uninterrupted names of descendants, which is really really challenging. Do we see anything like that within kind of the Greek world?
Yeah, for sure. The closest comparisons are in the Greek world. You get the catalog of women, which is very similar. We have to reconstruct it because it's not, we don't. Mostly in the Greek world, you have a lot of references and later sources that quote, and then you kind of reverse engineer the text.
Yep.
But yeah, there's a lot of them in there. It's even like things like the catalog of ships in the Iliad, which is just a long list of everybody who showed up. It's boring from modern perspectives as well. But yeah, I mean, like the history of interpretations of the tribal lists and tribal genealogical traditions have really been shaped in a bad way by the wrong set of comparisons, where biblical scholars in the middle of the 20th century got really into these like African oral tribal genealogies. And they
Yeah.
noticed that these African tribes were representing society in the form of a genealogy. They thought the biblical authors were doing the same thing, but they basically made up that like then they would just write it down and then just preserve it for hundreds of years, which is not what happens in Africa. And Africa changes constantly, in order to mark shifts in social organization. But it's really in ancient Greece, and people like Gary Knoppers has argued this, and now a lot of people have argued this in addition to me. You have people represented peoples represented in the forms of ancestors, ancestors represented in the form of genealogies, long discourses about their relationship to each other in a sort of prehistory that really is a representation of how a society should be organized. So, when you read Chronicles, what you see is that 1 Chronicles 1 stitches together a lot of different parts of Genesis to create a vision that connects Adam to Jacob.
Right. It's one of the few places that Adam is mentioned
Yep.
outside of Genesis 2,
Yeah.
which is, and 2 through 4 or whatever, which is really, again, very, very interesting.
Yeah, and one of the really interesting things about it too is if you look at the text, what you see is like some of it is what we call linear genealogy, which is like Adam and then this guy, and then this guy, and this guy. Some of it is what we call a segmented genealogy, which follows multiple lines of descent at once. It exactly corresponds to the text of Genesis. So if in Genesis that genealogy is a linear genealogy, then it shows up in 1 Chronicles 1 as linear genealogy. But if it's a segmented genealogy, etc., they really look like they're quoting, they're systematizing and putting it together. And then when you
Right.
read the Chronicles genealogy, you see like Judah's got a huge genealogy, Levi is right in the middle, just like in Numbers. Some of them are small. It's really, it's a representation of what was actually important in the Persian period context, likely that this was written, or the Hellenistic context.
Right. And again, it's so interesting because Chronicles is this one thing that feels like someone was trying to make a grand unifying thing of everything. They
Mhm.
fix a lot of the problems, or at least some of the problems that they'd identified of like conflicts within this. They piece everything together. Adam's there. It's all very organized and ordered in a certain way. But as you mentioned, you can still kind of see some of the sourcing behind it, and kind of because we can set these texts next to each other, we kind of understand to some extent how it was sort of programmatized and organized into this sort of way, which is again it's so fascinating that within the text you can see that it's so good.
Yeah, absolutely. what you're seeing is not the list of names that are supposed to be history. You're seeing dynamic representations of society that also provide a framework for further reorganizing society into different visions that pursue different agendas.
Right. Do we know at all, did with this idealization, did anyone ever try to even like incorporate this? Was this something that was ever pushed for as far as like a real organization of society? Because obviously they don't gain any sort of real independence. Will say that their self sovereignty is pretty limited
Mhm.
until the Hasmonean period for about 5 years until the flagging Selekids sort of turn them into a pseudo vassal again. Do
Yeah.
we have any like were these influential concepts in the early period that we're aware of?
Um, the only tribes that we can see in the Persian period, Hellenistic period, and for a lot of late antiquity are Judah, Levi, and Benjamin. Whether they were important, I think that there was like social structures in which they were important. When you look at the Talmud, you do see people talking about their ancestry in terms of tribes and how it makes one rabbi better than another, or and descending from David was big, of course.
Oh well, obviously.
Yeah, and then Levi, you get the sense that Levites are sort of like quasi priestly personnel in this period, and not so much the priests. Maybe that's the Aaronites, maybe that's the Zadokites, but that obviously mattered in a real way. And
Hmm.
like I say, Paul talks about himself as a Benjaminite. It must have meant something to him. But in terms of like political and social structures, I'm not aware of like you guys like they have in Athens. They have tribes, and it matters. They get together and we've got a president of the tribe that he represents us in the assembly or whatever. We don't see that in ancient Israel and Judah.
That part lends it almost an even more heightened sort of mythic quality, which we're off to the races here basically after this point, because this idea of lost tribes, this idea of a greater Israel with this mythic quality to it, uh, doesn't really exist to a serious degree in the real world. It's sort of in the realm of idealization almost entirely, which means it can be lent towards sort of a reconfiguring of what that means and for people to sort of adapt it. Again, it starts off as this mythic thing to some degree, reflecting some social realities. But again, we're off to the races here. Who's the first one that, after the Judahites, that kind of grabs onto this idea of Greater Israel?
In terms of the lost tribes,
Yeah.
yeah. Well, Josephus talks about them. A number of early rabbinic texts talk about them. You repeatedly get the idea that they've sort of like gone beyond a river. In some places it's the Sabbath River, the Sambachan, which is a mystical river. Um, and you just have some early Jewish texts. I mean, Tobit is set in the Assyrian Empire among some. There's a tribal, identities are present in that text. You have 4 Ezra has a vision of the return of the lost tribes. Even there's even biblical prophecies that talk about the return and restoration of the lost tribes. Um, but like a lot of things, I would say that there are early Jewish traditions, and then the idea of the lost tribes became particularly popular when Christians picked it up.
And Christians sort of glom onto this to a degree. Some Christians will say that obviously the first couple centuries of Christianity is extremely diverse, and we don't have, I think, a lot of good texts for some of the groups and kind of how they identified themselves within this structure. However, even within kind of canonical New Testament texts, we do get references to this idea, this conceptualization of Israel, not always specifically referencing tribes, but they do kind of, again, kind of. I don't even know how to say it. I don't want to say steal this identity, but they certainly adapt it. And as it gets outside of ethnically Jewish culture, it does kind of gain something. I think though the Christians would be probably the first people, as far as I'm aware, that kind of expanded outside of these ethnic identities that it was tied to beforehand. What does that look like?
Yeah, you get a mix of sort of travelogues, and you get a lot of so the fact that in the Bible the restoration of the lost tribes is tied to the end of the world. Even in Jeremiah and Ezekiel and places like that, you get like they'll come back someday. We're going to be restored, and these things will happen. That obviously is very important to a lot of Christian authors who are also thinking about the end of the world a lot. And so, as Christians get to know more of the world, then they start seeing lost tribes in a lot of different places. And I think the main thing is, if you're somebody who believes in the Bible in a literal way, if you're talking about Noah's flood, you already, as you're embarking on the age of exploration, going to be looking through the lens of like who was even left after the flood. In Genesis 10, the table of nations, it's like these are the sons of Japheth, these are the sons of Ham and Shem. They're looking for these people and they're looking for the tribes, and they find them everywhere. And
Incredible.
everywhere that they meet a new place, they're like, oh, it's the lost tribes are here.
Who's our first example of that we're aware of?
Who was the first example? I really don't know. I mean, I've been working on too many other books since the
Fair
Lost
enough.
Tribe book. I'm sure it's in there, but I think you really see it gain popularity with the age of exploration in the
Yeah.
1400s, 1500s, and so on. So like when Columbus shows up here, I don't think that he was very interested in the lost tribes, but there were people like Bartolome de las Casas who thought the natives could be the lost tribes. That continues. Mormonism is really based on this. The Book of Mormon is about lost tribes coming to America. But there's even things like, when the Mongols start showing up in the 1100s and 1200s, there are people who are kind of excited at first that they're the lost tribes because that could mean like Jesus is around the corner. And then
Sure,
as you
sure.
get closer to Europe, then like more anti-Semitic kinds of things show up, and Matthew of Paris and things like that.
Well, and that
Um,
was right after, because there was the big eschatological panic of the 11th century, or the 10th and 11th century. So it's kind of
yeah,
the hangover period of that era too, keeping the dream alive. Jesus is
right.
coming back. That's interesting, and yeah, and this you mentioned the Mormons. This idea certainly we get, especially in the 1800s, and especially in the 1800s, everything changes in the 1800s. That's the unifying theory of history. Once you hit the 19th century,
Right.
everything shifts. Um, that's also when we get the kind of foundations of things like British Israelism, and
Mhm.
other kind of, again, more co-opting in highly intellectualized and sophisticated ways of Israelite identity. And we get into this modern period where we have so many claimants to the idea of being the lost tribe. Not like you said, initially it comes from Christians looking at other people, looking at Native Americans, looking at, again, like you said, the Mongols, like encountering these people. Now we get these kind of self-claimants to being the lost tribe. So what does that look like? Who
Yeah.
you got in the modern era
Yeah.
for our potentials? Who are our candidates here?
You got a lot. And like to be clear, I mean, like, there are both Jewish and Christian early things. There are, the Alexander Romance, the lost tribes are out there somewhere. You've got a lot of rabbinic texts that deal with where the lost tribes are, when they might come back, and what that'll look like. And you do have like Benjamin of Tudela in the 1100s is a Jewish explorer who as he goes farther and farther into places that like used to be associated with Assyria, he finds more supposedly Israelites and so on. But yeah, I mean, today it is an enormous phenomenon. There's people everywhere. There's Maori claims, there's Indian claims, there's the Abba Yudaya of Uganda. Um, there's, actually a bunch of different groups in Africa. There's, of course, the Beta Israel of Ethiopia. Um, and yeah, I mean, the Mormons initially started out in the 1830s looking for the lost tribes and not thinking of themselves as the lost tribes. The Book of Mormon is a story about how some lost tribes came here and became the natives, and they're supposed to look for them. But pretty early on, they were like, we're probably the lost tribes too. And today, in the like patriarchal blessing that Mormons get when they come of age, they learn what lost tribe they're supposed to be a part of. Um, there's people in Japan, there's people in China, really just genuinely all over.
Right.
Afghanistan.
Oh wow. Okay. Yeah, and I mean, again, it's very interesting because, like, I think the Talmud there is some early Jewish text, if I recall correctly, that does reference like there are references to diaspora communities, and we know these places did exist for a long time, right? Like in Iraq, there were Jewish communities for basically probably since the initial like destruction of Samaria. There were these Yahwistic worshiping people whose entire lives changed. We see that at Elephantine.
Yeah,
Again, it shifts their identity, changes. Carl Van de Toorn will be going over that in this show. Everyone at home, be patient there. But there are these communities of diaspora, and from what we can see, some of the identities maybe don't look as nice and as mythical as the 12 lost tribes concept. It doesn't look like the end of the world. It mostly looks like people kind of just living their lives,
that's right.
uh,
Yeah,
which
I mean, one
is,
of the
yeah.
like hidden dynamics here is like just like you say, people just go to a lot more places than you think they're going to. So, European Christians, they run into Jews on the Silk Road. And they're like, they must be the lost tribes of Israel. And it's like, well, I mean, just Jewish traders went farther than you thought they did. That's the kind of thing that happens a lot.
Right, absolutely. So that, I guess, gets us into the sort of modern period. What are the most interesting examples that you found that you're personally interested in of
Yeah.
this kind of lost tribes concept?
So I think the Beta Israel are really interesting. One of the really interesting thing about them is they sort of become Israel twice. So I know people they really like the idea that the Beta Israel descend from an early Jewish community there. And I'm not going to say that there weren't potentially early Jewish influences on Ethiopia. There was a kingdom called Himyar that was just across the Red Sea. That was a Jewish kingdom in the, I think, 400s, 500s. So it's not, as if it's impossible, but we don't see a community that thinks of itself and can really be described as the Beta Israel before, I want to say, the 14th century BC, CE in the area of Lake Tana. And we actually see Christian Israelites in Ethiopia before that. So the Solomonic dynasty was founded. I'm forgetting some of the dates now, but I want to say in the late 12th, maybe the 13th century. And they lasted until 1972, 1973. Haile Selassie was the last Solomonic king. They have a tradition called the Kebra Nagast, which is like a, kind of Ethiopian corpus of traditions. One of them is that Solomon's son, Menelik, the son of Solomon and the Queen of Sheba, founded the kingdom of Ethiopia and the Solomon dynasty. So that actually seems to precede explicit Beta Israel identification. And when Beta Israel identification emerges as a kind of Jewish version of this, it does so in response to the Ethiopian context, where initially the Beta Israel is saying, like, yes, we're also descended from Solomon and Sheba, but we didn't convert to Christianity like you guys did. But when the Jewish world finally discovers the Beta Israel in the right at the end of the 18th century, but also mostly in the 19th century, really, they have a totally different story in mind. In the, I want to say 893 or so, this guy named Eldad shows up in Kairouan in North Africa, claiming to be from the tribe of Dan, who he says is living in Kush. Probably not an Ethiopian. Kush had long been identified with Ethiopia. Probably not a Beta Israel. Beta Israel probably don't exist yet. Probably not even an Ethiopian. People have looked at some of his writings and said maybe he was Yemeni, something like that.
Okay, so yeah, around kind of that southern Red Sea sort of
Yeah,
Yemen. Yeah, yeah, okay.
yeah. So, but the Kairouan Jewish community is like, who is this guy? They send a letter to the rabbi, the Gaon Asura, to investigate whether this guy could really be a lost tribe. And the Gaon Asura does and says, yes, I think he's a member of the lost tribe of Dan. So from that point on, there's a tradition that the tribe of Dan lives in Kush. All right. Again, there are no Beta Israel yet. They're not even, the
Right.
Solomon dynasty doesn't even exist yet. But it just so happens that when the Jewish world hears about this community of Jewish and Israelite identifying people in Ethiopia, they're in, Kush. So they think they found the lost tribe of Dan. And like basically they go there and they're like, you guys are Danites. And they're like, are we? I don't know. Um, but when the Beta Israel ultimately accepted into Israel in the 1970s officially, and then really through the 80s and 90s, it's
Yeah.
because the rabbis ruled that they're the tribe of Dan, and not because of the Kebra and not because of their own traditions. It's because of a long, more than 1,000 year long rabbinic history of identifying the lost tribe of Dan with Cush, which is Ethiopia. So that's really interesting. I've been thinking about the Black Hebrew Israelites a lot lately.
Hell
I
yeah.
think really, like the Black Hebrew Israelites are like very anti-Semitic, hate group. But
Well,
there are
hold
many,
on, Andrew. That's just because you're a son of Esau. That's
that's right, I don't understand it. But there are many Hebrew Israelite groups that are not anti-Semitic, and they just think of themselves as Jews.
right.
And their history is a common history that plays out all over the world, where in this case, there were a lot of enslaved Africans who, for various reasons, simply identified with their traditions that they would have thought of as the Old Testament, more maybe than the New Testament. They're in bondage in a foreign land. It makes sense to think of themselves through the lens of the story of Moses and the Exodus. And of course, you have the spirituals, which are often about the Old Testament and Moses, and go down Moses and Daniel and the Lion's Den, things like that. So over the course of the 19th century, in a post-emancipation framework, a couple people have these visions that actually the original Israelites were black. And over time, a huge variety of different groups emerged, of which the Black Hebrew Israelites are the most visible. But there are plenty of others, which again are just, black communities that understand themselves to be Jewish, that have a history that's really a lot like the Beta Israel in their own way. And you know, uh, this is what happens where because biblical traditions are in a way for everybody, they can become the charter traditions for anybody all of a sudden. And then there's Israel's all over the world.
Yeah, absolutely. It is this kind of potent. Uh, I don't know. You could call it a almost a tool, a metaphor that serves as a political tool, and you can kind of see it. What makes it so interesting in the modern era is that you're talking about like things where we can sort of see the developments of a lot of this that we don't have the window into for how this functioned in the past and how these kind of like we were talking earlier about Samaritan influence or
Mm-hmm.
northern influence on the texts that preserve some of the earliest versions of this tradition. And obviously, anything's possible in that area because we don't have any visibility into that process, into the process of the composition of the Pentateuch, into the process of like we can only roughly sketch out what that looks like. Whereas here, you can talk about kind of the compromise that Ethiopians had to make in order to gain Israeli national citizenship, like to be able to essentially be included. They essentially had to accept kind of a compromise where their own history was subordinated
Mm-hmm.
to a more mainline Jewish kind of orthodoxy and tradition. And again, it makes me kind of think like there's got to be so much more of that in the actual like formation of these identities that we see,
Right.
which is makes it again really interesting. And I know it's a little bit fraught to look into the past like that necessarily. We can't know that one to one where that happened, but again, it's so much. It is so interesting to look at how that plays out in the modern era. So who's your favorite of your groups here of modern? Who are you picking for the real lost tribe?
You know, um, it's a really tough question. I mean, like you say, like basically, there probably were these communities in Babylon and places like that from the beginning who are actually, these groups that are what we think of as lost tribes. The difference is that they just weren't lost. And so they don't identify by tribe anymore, but they still identify as Jewish. And, there's not really any Jews in Iraq anymore, but until recently there were. And yeah, they were probably there's evidence of at least a 2,600, 2,700 year history in that region. And I think that's fascinating.
Yeah,
But I also
absolutely.
think that, there's something about what I call a world full of Israels. I just had an article published on this subject that really tells us about identity itself works.
Yeah,
where like we typically think of identities as foreign from traditions that are specific and that belong to us. Like French people have a core of French traditions they can work with. But everybody also has, not everybody, but almost everybody also has the Bible, where, like you go to temple or you go to church or you aren't even religious at all, but you know these stories, and they are literally the charter traditions of the Israelites, or the Judahites pretending to be Israelites, or however you think about it. And so they're already part of your cultural milieu as available identity traditions. Your mind doesn't necessarily make the distinction between like, okay, but that's not specific to us. Because when you're in, whatever, you're reading their story, you're identifying with it. And that's just what happens over and over again is like people pivot from specific, regionally typical identity constructions to Israel identity constructions that are equally available because they are, you know, in this book that has made its way around the world too.
Yeah, absolutely. That part of it, I think, it kind of, again, it sort of clicked into place to realize like we do have this tradition, basically going back to when it was first written, of kind of co-opting identity for something greater, and that is obviously something that finds its parallels even before this period. Obviously, you get Babylon is everyone wants to be Hammurabi. Sargon the Second really wants to be Sargon the First, who kind of we don't really know much about him, but like there is always this kind of looking into hoary antiquity and kind of placing yourself into their shoes and kind of saying, yes, that's me. You get, I mean, again, you get Saddam Hussein kind of propagandizing himself as these ancient Mesopotamian kings, and yet because specifically these 12 tribes conceptions are created in the context of repeated destruction and devastation, that it provides this kind of consolation to peoples who, both for political, like cynical reasons, but as you said, it also provides a powerful metaphor for people who are experiencing real oppression and who have gone through, to put it scientifically, some serious shit, to kind of see themselves as being part of that tradition as well, which again, I think your book does, the myth of the 12 tribes does a wonderful job of kind of explicating on that. So
Thank you. Yeah, appreciate it.
absolutely. And I think there were two Jewish guys in Afghanistan until recently.
Yep.
Famously, they did not get along very well with each
Right.
other. I don't think they were talking by the end of it. I think they may have been kicked out because they were just so annoying or something. Like it
Right.
is very like it's a very Jewish story.
I remember
There's
that
so
story.
much good stuff with that. Another thing that Irving Finkel talks about is that, for example, in India, you had a Jewish diaspora community that was still playing a board game. The I think it's called a few different things, the Royal Game of Babylon or something along those lines. But they were still playing this board game that we have versions of from the like late Bronze Age. So there is kind of, again, there is something real there. There is this real identity that passes through time, and then there are all of these idealizations of it,
Yeah.
which again is
Yeah, and I think one other aspect of this that's really important that I talk about a lot is you have to think about the structure of the 12 tribes tradition, which by its very nature says 12 different things are secretly one thing.
yeah,
That's segmented identity traditions for you. And so that makes it flexible in a way a lot of other traditions aren't. And as you alluded to, like I actually do think that what Judah does with Israelite identity, it's not tremendously different from what other people are doing. But what makes it possible is that if you have 12 things that are all one thing, if 10 of them are supposedly disappeared, they're somewhere all around the world, you can find it at least 10 times. There's nothing, somebody in India says we're this tribe, we're that tribe. There's no
sure.
contradiction. So it's really actually easy to write yourself into Israelite identity. The Judahites probably did it. And then lots of people have been doing it since.
Absolutely. Fantastic. Well, I think to bring us out to a close here, do you have anything to plug, and where can folks find your stuff?
Great. So yeah, I just had a book came out, a Cambridge Element book that's about Israelite identity So Cambridge Elements are like they're short books, or like the short introductions. It's about Israelite
And very
competition.
available and not super
Very
expensive.
available, not very
We
expensive.
I just had Eric Harvey on to talk about his from the same series,
Right.
not the same series, but from Cambridge Elements. If you're gonna get a book, get these ones. They're so good.
Yeah, and this is so it's about the competition over Israel identity in late antiquity, especially late antiquity between Christians, Jews, Samaritan Israelites. It's where we get a lot of these ideas from. Um, I am
When you're
more.
talking about late antiquity, you're talking about like 6th through 8th
Yeah,
century,
I mean,
like
so
where.
so late antiquity is pretty much a biblical, a scholarly term for the period after antiquity until the medieval period. So people define it in vastly different ways.
Right.
But
I was like, what are
yeah,
we talking about late antiquity? Because
yeah.
is it post
But the book
Constantine? What?
talks about, like, there's even stuff about Paul in there, which is the first
Cool.
century CE, and Josephus and people like that. But mostly it's about the, let's say, 300 to 600 period, where you see the Talmuds emerging. That probably continues in the 7th or 8th century, and a lot of Jewish traditions, and where you see a lot of patristics, where we see a lot of the early Justin Martyr, people like that, Origen, Antony the Great. So especially, I would say 200 to 500 or so.
Okay.
But it's about, yeah, how these ideas developed in the context of this competition. And yeah, I mean, I think that it sheds a lot of light there on how we got to today, where there's now all these different claimants with all these different characteristics.
Any good groups in there, like kind of oddballs or idiosyncratic groups within that?
There's a lot of really interesting ones. I mean, you any oddballs? Um, I think one of the if there's one story that I think would be like a good concluding story,
Yeah.
it's this story of the British Israelites, who are not in this book, obviously, but Mormon. So I came across this bunch of letters. So a Mormon goes to see the British Israelites. He goes to a British Israelite meeting, and because the Mormon thinks he's an Israelite and he thinks it's plausible the British Israelites are the Israelites, why not? And he goes there and he's like, oh my gosh, these guys are so anti-Semitic, because the British Israelites are like, we're actually Israel,
And
and the
this would have been
Jews,
what, like turn of the century, like around
yeah, around
1900?
late 1800s, or
Yeah.
maybe around turn of the century.
And so for a Mormon to be saying, "Wow, you're anti-Semitic,"
Yeah,
is probably really something at the time.
yeah, because the British Israelites, so they're like, we're Israel, and the Jews are not.
Yeah.
The Jews are Judah, and that's worse. And it just, like, it's horrible, but it
Ooh.
also just speaks to the flexibility of this tradition. That here are all these people who really believe they're Israelites. They think they can make common cause. There's actually a lot of Hebrew Israelites in Israel today. They live in a place called Dimona, because, like the Beit Israel, they think of themselves as Israelites. They think should have citizenship. A lot of controversy there. But yeah, I mean, the capacity for people to find ways to identify with Israelites. And I guess if I had one more group to talk about, I would talk about the Israelite House of David. You familiar with these guys?
I'm not. Go ahead.
They were headquartered in Bainville, Michigan, and they are
Okay.
best known. So this is the 19th century.
Bainville, Michigan, as everyone knows, is essentially Hebron of the
Yeah,
modern world. So,
that's right. That's it. They are best known for their baseball team, which was like the Harlem Globetrotters at the time. So they would barnstorm. They would play some of the great Negro Leagues teams when nobody else would. They would like ride camels in the outfield, and they would do all these tricks. And they wore these really big beards. Like they grew them, or they wore them, or they whatever.
do they have tassels?
They didn't have tassels. They just had the beards.
Okay.
They
Okay.
were the fundraising arm for like a really weird group living in Bainville, Michigan, who thought their mission was to ingather the 12 tribes of Israel and bring about the end of the world in Michigan.
Once again, in
Yeah,
Michigan.
in
Yeah.
Michigan.
Yeah.
So that's the kind of thing.
Wait for deindustrialization to happen.
That's right.
That'll feel like the end of the world. But
That's right. So, I mean, that's what you get. You get these just, it's a fascinating, globe trotting phenomenon with all these particularities. But that's what you can do. You can pick it up and you can do what you want with it.
that's phenomenal. So, where can people find you online?
That's a great question. Yeah, I mean,
If you want to be found. If you don't want to be
yeah,
found, that's okay.
I'm at work at William and Mary. You can look up my email address there. I don't really have a website, but I have various kinds of writing all over the internet if you look for it. So I'm around.
Thanks again so much for coming on the show, Andrew. This was so fun.
Thank you. I really appreciate it. It's great to talk to you.
Yeah, absolutely. And for everyone supporting the show on Patreon, I will see you next time on the Bible Lore Podcast.